as he considers Old's prophecy about what literacy would do to him. The young Douglas has another very Western experience, an epiphany. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. The host of Joe's Great Books is Joe Sharkey. He teaches at the University of Washington, Tacoma, but is not speaking for or sponsored by the UW. Hello, everybody. Welcome to podcast number 9 of Joe's Great Books. As always, I'll ask you to help us out and subscribe, like, comment, or share. Apparently, that's what gets a podcast circulated and the podcaster rich and allows him to buy a mansion and a yacht like Elmer Fudd. Now, as you know, I'm not an Americanist, yet podcast 4 was about Mark Twain and podcast 8 was about Walt Whitman. Today's podcast, the very next one, is about yet another American author, and this one a Black American, Frederick Douglass. Specifically, his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. If you've been to college, you may know that American literature has traditionally been taught in its own track, not typically mixed with English or European literature, and in my experience, too infrequently included in great books' curricula. So you might be asking, what's a Black American like Douglass doing in a podcast like this? Didn't all the long-time, dead, white men of the great books of the Western tradition stand athwart the gateway to bar the newly dead black man from entering the castle? Isn't the history of our decisions in the West about whom to read and whom not to read determined by power and only power, because we humans are in fact not logos animals, but kratos animals? That is, because we are defined not by our possession of reason, but by our possession of power. Because power, 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 as the woke folks say. No. That crap is bad for your soul, so don't eat it. If there's a gateway, it's not made out of iron, but of humble wood. And to gain entry, all you have to do is break the door down with your head, like everyone else. I've said it before. If the tradition is a castle, it's a castle under siege, one that loves to have its defenses breached. But don't name it dirty, says Brick. And here's the thing. Anybody is welcome to try. Like stringing Odysseus's bow. What do I know? Maybe instead it's that everyone who knocks gets in, which means we're all welcome. If that's true, though, I'm sure there are assigned seats. You can sit next to me in the very, very back, with an occluded view. However it is, I'm sure that when Douglass arrived at the door, they watched him smash his way in, and then applauded and embraced him as a brother, in arms and letters. But could be that's not the question anyone's asking. Maybe the question is, what's a hunky like me doing recording a podcast like this on a black author like Douglass? Shouldn't I leave Douglass to a Black American, or at least a brown American, or anything but a white American? Isn't this a kind of cultural appropriation? Of course not. I know Douglass, his story, his teaching, his example belongs to me because he inspires me. Something in me, many things in me, answer to him. If that's not good enough, well, you know who I blame? Douglass. I didn't appropriate him. He appropriates me. And I'm better for it. You will be too. Now, how can that happen across time and identity and lived experience? Well, Douglas was a rational animal, just like me, just like you. He had a body and a mind and a soul, and so do I, and so do you. And he quickens each of those aspects of my person. What more proof do I need that we are part of the same tradition? None, I wouldn't think. But in case we do, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Dr. Glenn Loury, eminent economist at Brown University, who stole my thunder in a speech he gave at the inaugural MIT Free Speech Alliance conference in September of 2023, which seems to be based on a speech he gave a few years before. He says, I'm going to defend a controversial thesis in my remarks today, to wit, freedom of speech in American society needs to be protected from the excesses of a universally embraced ethic of anti-racism. I'm going to argue that, ironically, the failure to do so could seriously undermine the worthy goal of achieving a just society. He ends his speech with his counter-narrative to the anti-racist bias narrative. I am a Black American intellectual in an age of persistent racial inequality in my country. I'm an Ivy League college professor and a descendant of slaves. I am a beneficiary of the civil rights revolution that has made possible for me a life that my forebears could only dream of. I am a patriot who loves his country. I am a man of the West. I am an inheritor of its great traditions. Tolstoy, mine. Franklin, mine. Hamilton, mine. Adams, mine. Newton, Maxwell, Einstein, mine. He continues. According to my counter-narrative, the currently fashionable elite opinion concerning blacks' relationship to the American project serves the interests of neither the country nor of we Black Americans. Our birthright citizenship in this, history's greatest republic, is an inheritance of immense value. Black Americans are a privileged and blessed people. Our Americanness is much more important than our blackness. And he finishes. Something new emerged at the end of the 18th century in the North American continent, and the subsequent extirpation of American slavery led to something that advanced the morality and the dignity of humankind. It is a fact that abolition and the incorporation of African-descended people into the body politic of the United States of America were monumental, unprecedented achievements for human freedom. So, I say here and now, without equivocation, that the American nation belongs to me, a descendant of slaves, every bit as much as it belongs to anyone else. Mic drop. I love what Dr. Loury said in his address. He's a steady source of such wisdom, so I encourage you to watch his podcast, The Glenn Show, especially when Dr. John McWhorter is on every couple of weeks. But I have to say, I think the best part of Loury's speech was the first questioner, whom I will let speak for himself. He starts off by saying, I'm going to get into trouble, but it turns out to be good trouble. I just had to disagree with something you said, and I can't not say it. You said our Americanness is more important than our blackness. This is untrue. Our blackness is our Americanness, and our Americanness is our blackness. We made this country. We are Americans. There are no more American people than the black people of the United States. We defined freedom. The struggles of our people in this country define freedom, not just for Americans, but for the world. When those people in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, they sang, "We shall overcome." They talked, they hearkened to us. Black people, we play a historical role. Black Americans, we are a new people. I'm married to an African woman. I have African children. I'm not African. I'm American. We made this country because it is the black people of the United States of America who taught the world what it means to be free. Simple as that. Without black people, you do not have the America as we know it. You don't. You just don't. We are Americans. That's all I wanted to say. Pick up the mic so you can drop it again. Lowry accepted what the man said as a friendly amendment and said he appreciated the passion the man clearly took. He got emotional in his profession of his Americanness. The man's name wasn't given, but I'd love to know it. I've heard others say on behalf of Black Americans, we built this country. And while I know there's a great deal of truth to that claim literally, slaves built the Capitol building, for example, I admit it always made me wince a bit because it suggested that no one of any other identity actually helped build any buildings, which of course is silly, but more so because it seemed to me one of those desperate cries of hyperbole that everyone is supposed to pretend to believe, or at least not to object to, which, aside from being dishonest, is condescending. But this fellow in Dr. Lowry's audience understood it in a more profound way, and I absolutely buy the way he put it and am touched by it, as Lowry was. I won't try to improve on the way he expressed it, but I will turn it to my advantage here, because what Dr. Lowry said before and what this gentleman said after strengthens my justification of and love for the great books, and the importance not just of the American participation in it, but of the Black American participation in it. Surely the easiest way to determine whether or not a particular author belongs to the tradition is to let him tell us. With Douglas, it's easy to see. He invokes it frequently. The book of Genesis, several times. The book of Job, at least 3 times. And consider that in 2 of these times, he only alludes to it instead of naming it outright, which means he expects his educated audience to know the book. That is, he expects them to be part of the tradition in which he himself is writing. Same for the Gospels and the Epistles. And Shakespeare, who, as we all know, wrote the King James Version of the Bible, for sure, for reals. Similarly, Douglas only alludes to Hamlet, and possibly to The Tempest, as I'll explain later. He also invokes Patrick Henry, William Cowper, Richard Sheridan, John Greenleaf Whittier, and Charles Dickens, whom he also published in the Frederick Douglass newspaper. Over 21 months from April 1852 to December 1853, he published all of Dickens' Bleak House, a very long novel. And Douglas took his own surname from a poem by Sir Walter Scott. That's a long list of honkies. Now, what if Douglas waited until there was a Black American slave before he allowed himself, his soul, to be inspired? There had to be a first. Well, actually, an internet search tells me that that would be Phyllis Wheatley, but you get my point. When Douglas writes of Richard Sheridan, whom he discovered in a collection of speeches titled The Columbian Orator, he says, "In the same book, I met with one of Sheridan's mighty speeches in behalf of Catholic emancipation. These were choice documents to me. I read them over and over again with unabated interest. They gave tongue to interesting thoughts of my own soul, which had frequently flashed through my mind and died away for want of utterance. The moral which I gained from the dialogue was the power of truth over the conscience of even a slaveholder." We'll come back to that. What he says here shows that a great book often just pricks the soul and lets out what's already there. And what's in the soul of an Anglo-Irishman can also be in the soul of a Black American. Sheridan is mine, says Douglas. So, Dr. Lowry stole my thunder, but I think he'd agree we can share. So, like him, I can say, I am a patriot who loves his country. I am a man of the West. I am an inheritor of its great traditions. Frederick Douglass? Mine. Now, I'm only a student of Douglass's, not a Douglass scholar. I only returned to him after a lapse of many years because I use him in my free speech class. When I first thought of doing this podcast, my plan was just to take note of a handful of connections I was beginning to see between Douglass and the Western tradition. As such, I thought this podcast was going to be short. No. I saw very quickly it was going to take more than one show. I decided to keep each of them short, so I turned it into a 3-parter. Let's see if people like shorter better. In any case, the more I looked, the more I found in common between Douglass and other great books. I could have done a whole show just comparing Douglass with George Orwell. Maybe I will later. In any case, these 3 episodes will be almost as much about the other great books as they'll be about Douglas's narrative. Now, this commonality with other great books is not to imply identicality or even thoroughgoing agreement. If you think that's what the Western tradition is about, then you've read less than or equal to one of its books because you're just assuming they all say the same thing. That's what some people are taught. But how boring would that be? That misunderstanding might lead you to be surprised or even dubious that Douglas, a black slave of white men who excoriates Christian hypocrisy, could rightly be considered a part of the Western tradition at all. But of course he is. The tradition is full of rebels, especially rebels who excoriate hypocrisy. Or did you think Jesus was establishment? Well, where should we start to hunt out connections between Douglas and the Western tradition? How about the very first paragraph of his narrative? I was born in Tuckahoe, near Hillsborough, and about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. By far the larger part of the slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs, and it is the wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant. I do not remember to have ever met a slave who could tell of his birthday. They seldom come nearer to it than planting time, harvest time, cherry time, springtime, or fall time. A want of information concerning my own was a source of unhappiness to me, even during childhood. The white children could tell their ages. I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege. I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. He deemed all such inquiries on the part of a slave improper and impertinent, and evidence of a restless spirit. The nearest estimate I can give makes me now between 27 and 28 years of age. I come to this from hearing my master say, sometime during 1835, I was about 17 years old. That's all you need to know. Douglas asks several questions fundamental to the West, right there in paragraph 1. And he was well aware they'd been asked before. He wants to know when he was born. The way of asking, who am I? The quest for understanding of the self. In the next few pages, he'll ask who his father was. He wonders why he's treated the same as birthdayless horses. And suspecting an important difference between himself and the animals, he's beginning to ask, what is a man? He's clearly indignant that he isn't supposed to ask about such things, that some knowledge is forbidden to him, which implies a question. Who are you to tell me what I can and can't know? Or, why can't I feed my hunger for knowledge, forbidden or not? Or, what does that piece of fruit over there taste like? No, not the fruit on that tree, the fruit on that one, over there, behind the red tape. Douglas's recognition of these various limits adds up to the question, why am I being treated unfairly? This is the longing for justice and the resentment of injustice. Now, these questions overlap and develop as you try to answer them. So, for the 3 parts of this podcast, I'll collect them. At first, I thought to use 2 related questions. Who am I? And what is a man? But as I went along, I soon saw that for Douglas, those 2 questions are essentially identical. So I'll reduce them both to one, both universal and particular, as all the best questions are. What is a man? And is Douglas one? Asking all these questions, or just the one, implies a quest for answers. We could think of Douglas's narrative as a mystery story. Will our young hero find out when he was born? Will he discover who he is? Or will he remain in ignorance? What will become of his restless spirit? Will he find justice and become free? In this way, the mature Douglas, quite consciously, in the way of an artist, sets up the young Douglas, and vicariously, us readers, for a hero's journey. which makes this podcast a good time to introduce this Western contrivance, a concept useful in understanding all sorts of works of literature, which for unfathomable reasons seems to apply equally well to people of different times and places and civilizations. I've even seen people, students of different skin tones, some darker, some lighter, make use of this concept, almost as if skin tone has nothing to do with it. Now, admission, I don't know where I originally got these graphs. Pretty sure it's not Joseph Campbell. His most famous graph is round, and it has some nice elements to it. It's roundness. But it's a bit too prescriptive. Not every story has all its details. I do know that Kurt Vonnegut used a graph like the three I'm going to draw, and though it's possible he and I got the same idea from a third common source, call it Q, for Quella, you have to love Vonnegut. So I'm going with him as my source officially. I'll add a link to his video lecture. It's fun. Vonnegut, of course, immediately begins to fuck around. Okay, so let's talk about the three archetypal graphs of the hero's path. Archetype is like first form arche plus tupos, so it's like the first mold from which you make a series of other pots. Turns out that stories are something like that, that there really isn't, if you look at them at their essence, that many different kinds of story, especially if you're just plotting them out from beginning to middle to end. So the metaphor I often use is that when you read a novel, say, it's like you're wending your way through a forest. You don't really have a good idea of where you're going. You can't see the forest through the trees. So what you can do is climb up on a mountain and fly over in a helicopter and get the aerial perspective. That way you can kind of see the shape of the forest and understand it better when you go travel through it again on foot. So it's helpful to reduce a story to its essence, just like it might be to pluck the skeleton out of an animal. But of course, caution, you would never want to reduce the story to the graph and think that you have somehow found all you need to find about it. There's much more to it. You always want to put the flesh and the organs back on that skeleton. And as I said, although there are, generally speaking, three paths that a hero's course can take, well, if you ever run into a story that doesn't fit one of these three graphs, obviously, you don't accommodate the story to the graph, you accommodate the graph to the story. If it doesn't fit any of the three, well, make a fourth. If it fits one but not perfectly, well, then add some articulation, embellish it, modify it as you see fit, of course. So the graphs you can draw just on a simple Cartesian grid, okay? Y-axis here, x-axis here. So as you go from left to right, you're simply moving through the chronology of the story in time, beginning, middle, end. What's the y-axis? Well, you can you can measure whatever you want on the y-axis, but I think a convenient thing to use is fortune. And by fortune, we don't mean cash or wealth or treasure. We just mean success. How well are things going for our hero, or how poorly? First graph looks like this. This one is called tragedy. Hero starts at some point. With tragedies, it's often high, but not necessarily. Generally, traditionally, a tragic hero is regarded as someone better than average, better than us, often a king or a prince or a queen or a hero. But this status quo that he starts with is interrupted. I'll draw a picture on the screen as I'm talking now so that you can do better than just looking at my hand gestures. But I'll draw an X in the status quo to show that a trigger disrupts it. Now, in your experience, what would you say? What tends to happen to heroes at the very beginning of their stories? Do things get better or do things get worse? Almost everybody agrees they tend to get worse. So the hero descends. Well, if he's going down, he's going to get to the lowest point. Maybe the story stops there, and that's generally what happens with tragedies. It gets down to its lowest point. It's nadir, which is just the opposite of an apex or an apogee, and it bottoms out. Story's done. Crash and burn. Now, there's more to it. We'll come back to that. Second story. Same situation as the first one. There's a status quo. Usually the hero is going to start somewhere in the middle, maybe a little bit low for this kind of story, because this one is a comedy. And the idea is that for comic stories, going back to Aristotle at least, the hero is like us or perhaps less than us. We get to laugh at the buffoon. Hero starts here. Status quo is disrupted by a trigger, and what happens? Well, often there's a descent to a nadir. Now, in situation comedies like this one, often what happens is that there is an initial ascent. Character rises, usually through no credit of his own. Think Homer Simpson, and gets to the top. Well, if you've watched a Simpson episode or 1,000, you're halfway through. You know that what happens is that he does something stupid, and he falls back down. Where does he land? Or if he falls to a lower point, where does he end? Where does he go? He rises back or falls back to the same place, the same height, the same fortune he started at. Why? Well, because he's got to do the same thing again next Thursday at 8 p.m. Tune in. It's cyclical. The comic hero typically never learns or never learns enough to escape this cycle of falling or rising and then ending back basically the same guy in the same situation, living the same mediocre or sub-mediocre life that he was living when we first met him. Third graph. This one is also called a comedy, but in this case, think of comedy in the older sense of the term, which simply meant not an unhappy ending like a tragedy, but a happy ending. So here, same thing, same axis, status quo, trigger here, descent to a nadir, ascent. But in this case, the ascent doesn't stop once it has counterbalanced the descent. It keeps going. The hero rises above his station and ends up here when he started down here. So keep it in the microphone. Anyway, he starts here and he ends up here. The ancient Greeks would have called that suffering into wisdom. Christians would call it dying to be reborn. In fact, I call this kind of comedy, this third graph, the divine comedy. Why? Well, because it reminds of the path that Dante traced in his three canticles. He descended in the Inferno, ascended in the Purgatorio, and then continued to ascend, completed his successful journey in Paradiso. It's also, obviously, the Christian path, suffering, death, resurrection, moving beyond not just earth originally or hell after death, but to heaven, which is better than the place where he started. How much better? Well, exactly that much better. I said before that you can shake it up. You could, and this applies for all three graphs, which you could easily put on one axis. Here's the tragedy, here's the sitcom, here's the divine comedy. Well, what you can do is instead of just measuring fortune or success on the y-axis, you could add in a secondary element. A good one would be wisdom or enlightenment or understanding. And then suddenly this very simplistic, reductive, stick-figure graph comes a little bit more to life. You see that in a tragedy, often what happens is as the character's fortune declines, his wisdom increases, such that the moment of his greatest suffering, his greatest misery, his greatest failure is also the moment of his greatest understanding or enlightenment. Think Oedipus the King, Macbeth, King Lear, any of the classics. Well, what happens to wisdom on a comedy graph? Generally speaking, in a sitcom, if your hero is Homer Simpson or someone like that, generally understanding starts low and kind of scuttles along the ground or fathoms and fathoms underneath the sea and never really rises. And that's what makes Homer funny. Sometimes what happens is he will seem to be on the verge of an insight, maybe one that will change his life. And no, he misses it. And that's part of the funniness. What about a divine comedy? Well, divine comedy looks like the tragic graph, where the hero, as he descends and as he rises some more, is generally learning as he goes. Now, when that's what happens in a tragedy, when a character falls and burns, but at the same time rises in understanding, such that the moment of his greatest suffering coincides with the moment of his greatest enlightenment, you can call that, as more than one student over the years suggested to me, a divine tragedy. So, as you could probably tell, the main thing that differentiates these three graphs is the ending. Douglas's life plays out a rather precise hero's journey, with a distinct nadir in which all hangs in the balance, and a subsequent heroic rise, and, I'm going to ruin it for you, a joyous triumph. It's a divine comedy, from death to new life, from hell to heaven. He escapes. Yay. I'll follow the hero's progress as we go, as I think Douglas himself did in his writing, though I doubt he drew it up as a graph. So let's dig into his story and begin with the status quo. Douglas was born into slavery. Already you have to modify the graph. He starts out just about at the bottom. Clearly, he's put well below neutrality or below happiness. But the fact that he can even intuit the question we've chosen as our center, what is a man, shows that he could sink still lower. And we'll find out that he does. Let's reread a little bit here. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. By far the larger part of the slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs, and it is the wish of most masters, within my knowledge, to keep their slaves thus ignorant. A want of information concerning my own was a source of unhappiness to me, even in childhood. I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. He deemed all of this a sign of a restless spirit. So Douglas's situation calls out archetypal Western questions. Like Oedipus the king, his identity is obscure to him. Like Adam and Eden, the very young Douglas can tell that he is different from the animals, yet unlike Adam, he can tell he's being treated as if he weren't. So he asks, who am I? What am I? If I am a man, what is a man? And he wonders, if he is a man, why doesn't he know his birthday, as the white children do? Is he an animal intended for higher things like them? Or just an animal like the horses? By the time he begins his narrative, then, he already knows the answer. And by his constant contrast between himself and other slaves on the one hand, and the livestock or brutes on the other hand, he makes it clear that he is aware of the traditional conception of man as a rational animal. Nowadays, we mostly take the word brute as a synonym for bully, a person who is strong and thuggish and wants your lunch money. People my age remember Popeye's Brutus. We don't think of the original definition of the word, which is simply a creature that lacks reason. That is, an animal, a creature clearly inferior to a man, and therefore subject to treatment we would call slavery if we inflicted it on a human being. This distinction is crucial to Douglas, and it seems to haunt him. It reminds me of Socrates' admonition to his fellow Athenians during his unapologetic apology, that while he can tell death is going to catch him before wickedness does, it's wickedness that is on their heels. For Douglas, throughout his narrative, he feels the breath of brutishness at his ear, no matter how fast he runs. As he sees how slaves are treated, the question posed to the young Douglas, only intuitively, but explicitly to the adult author, is, can his masters, by the daily grind of dehumanization that is slavery, make him forget that he is a rational animal? As we'll see as we go, Douglas has no doubt that this is their conscious goal. And that strikes me as an especially incriminating, damning fact. How did they effectuate it? Well, we might as well start with the obvious, the brutal and brutalizing violence. Douglas recalls seeing his Aunt Hester whipped mercilessly by his master. I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist, and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. And where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream and whip her to make her hush. And not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. I shall never forget it whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery, through which I was about to pass. It was a most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it. This scene is so gruesome, it might make us think we're starting at Douglas's nadir. But no, as in Dante, the vestibule to hell is only a horrific beginning. Because, of course, there were also subtler forms of destruction of the rational animal, but some just as potent. For example, the masters destroyed the family unit. Douglas had only tenuous family ties, his mother a slave elsewhere, able to visit only a handful of times before she died. She slept with him these few nights, but had to get up early enough to travel home before sunrise to avoid the beating she'd get if she were late. Douglas concludes this separation is done deliberately, quote, to hinder the development of the child's affection towards its mother, and to blunt and destroy the natural affection of the mother for the child. This is the inevitable result. I never saw my mother, to know her as such, more than 4 or 5 times in my life. End quote. And he adds, never by the light of day. That seems an especially cruel touch. You might say the slave owners had family values, which is why they knew it was important to deny them to their chattel. And of course, it works. Douglas reports his mother's death without hiding his estrangement from the deceased. She died when I was about 7 years old on one of my master's farms near Lee's Mill. I was not allowed to be present during her illness, at her death, or burial. She was long gone before I knew anything about it. I received the tidings of her death with much the same emotions I should have probably felt at the death of a stranger. End quote. As for his father, rumor had it he was Douglas's master. Yes, the man who whipped his aunt so viciously and thus escorted her nephew through the gates of slavery hell. That was probably Douglas's own father. There was no, and could have been no, relationship between them, even if it was desired, because any favoritism might have made trouble. After his mother died, there was no family unit to embrace child Douglas. He writes, my grandmother lived far off, so that I seldom saw her. I had 2 sisters and 1 brother that lived in the same house with me. But the early separation of us from our mother had well nigh blotted the fact of our relationship from our memories. Now, the comparison to equally birth date-less horses Douglas makes in paragraph number 1 is only the first of many such painful juxtapositions with animals. On mealtimes at his childhood plantation, he says, the children were then called like so many pigs, and like so many pigs, they would come and devour the mush, some with oyster shells, others with pieces of shingle, some with naked hands, and none with spoons. He that ate fastest got most. He that was strongest secured the best place, and few left the trough satisfied. Later, he moves to Baltimore, where the masters feed their slaves better, but he finds that there are exceptions. For example, the masters of a woman named Mary. I have seen Mary contending with the pigs. Pigs again. Or the offal thrown into the street. So much was Mary kicked and cut to pieces that she was oftener called pecked than by her name. This is the potent end to chapter 6. Douglas often ends his chapters with gut punches. This one, for example, seems like a gruesome precursor to the final scene of Orwell's Animal Farm. Later, when a master dies, Douglas is auctioned off as property with the sub-rational animals. We were all ranked together at the valuation. Men and women, old and young, married and single, were ranked with horses, sheep, and swine. There were horses and men, cattle and women, pigs, what else? And children, all holding the same rank in the scale of being, and were all subjected to the same narrow examination. The spectacle bothered him less for the personal experience than for the thought that his grandmother had to behold it. My poor old grandmother, he writes, she had served my old master faithfully from youth to old age. She had rocked him in infancy, attended him in childhood, served him through life, and at his death wiped from his icy brow the cold death sweat, and closed his eyes forever. She was nevertheless left a slave for life, a slave in the hands of strangers now, and in their hands she saw her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren divided like so many sheep. If this is Western civilization, it has unfortunately declined since the days of Eurycleia and Eumaeus, the elderly slaves in the Odyssey of perhaps 750 BC, who were at least respected by Odysseus and by Homer. So far, the techniques of brutalization we've seen are beatings, family untyings, and feedings. And then, of course, there's the relentless, inhumane excess of work, quantity you'd expect of an animal or a literal tool, like a hammer. Beyond the obvious cruelty and indignity of the labor, an especially insidious aspect of it is that it suffocates the rational faculty. Slave owners surely knew that Proverbs 16:27 says, "Idle hands are the devil's workshop," and they seem to expand it to include idle minds as well. Douglas writes that the slaves, quote, find less difficulty from the want of beds than from the want of time to sleep. For when their day's work in the field is done, the most of them having their washing, mending, and cooking to do, and having few or none of the ordinary facilities for doing either of these, very many of their sleeping hours are consumed in preparing for the field the coming day. And when this is done, old and young, male and female, married and single, drop down side by side on one common bed, cold, damp floor, each covering himself or herself with their miserable blankets. And here they sleep till they are summoned to the field by the driver's horn. The slave owners seem to have known what philosopher Joseph Pieper knew, that leisure is the basis of culture. That's the title of his excellent book of 1952, maybe a podcast later. No leisure, no culture, no cultivation of the mind. And what is a man, or even a prince, if he spends his time only on sleeping and feeding and working? A beast, a brute, no more. No leisure, no rational animal, just animal. As Douglas collects it, I have found that to make a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision, and, as far as possible, to annihilate power of reason. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. He must be made to feel that slavery is right, and he can be brought to that only when he ceases to be a man. End quote. No reason, no moral clarity, no recognition of injustice, no awareness of the self as a rational animal, no rebellion. And if you want to keep a slave boy from recognizing his rational soul and getting into good trouble, the last thing you'd want to do is to teach him to read. Which is what Sophia Old, the wife of Douglas's second master, Hugh Old, began to do. Douglas had been moved to Baltimore at the time, a better place for a slave than Maryland. He recalls, I was utterly astonished at her goodness. She was entirely unlike any other white woman I had ever seen. The crouching servility, usually so acceptable a quality in a slave, did not answer when manifested towards her. Her favor was not gained by it. She seemed to be disturbed by it. She did not deem it imprudent or unmannerly for a slave to look her in the face. The meanest slave was put fully at ease in her presence. When she looks at Douglas, she sees a boy, and she does what you do with a boy. You teach him the A, B, C. So our hero has begun his irrevocable ascent out of ignorance towards knowledge. No, because her husband quickly puts a stop to it. In the following passage, Douglas writes out the full N word, and I leave it the way he wrote it in the PDF I prepare for my students. But I won't say it this time as I did in the Mark Twain podcast, since this passage doesn't depend on the sound of the word as the one in Pudd'nhead Wilson does. Also because I don't want people to think that I'm going to say it just to say it. If you give a N-word an inch, he will take an L, like a yard. A N-word should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best N-word in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that N-word, speaking of myself, says Douglas, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. Note the self-incrimination in Master Auld's fear. He isn't saying, don't waste your time trying to teach that N-word to read. Slaves are incapable of that sort of learning, which is why it's justified to keep them as slaves. No, he's saying, don't teach that N-word to read. The truth is that slaves are capable of that sort of learning, and once he knows it, he'll never accept his unjustified thraldom again. So, just like his wife, Hugh Auld knows that Douglas is a rational animal, and will be no good as chattel if he comes to understand that himself. Why? Because it would make him discontented. We'll come back to that concept later. Master Auld is a slaver, but Master Auld is right. Before we go on, let's pause to consider another very Western idea that is demonstrated here by noting the fate of kind, humane Mrs. Auld. In his Inferno, Dante uses the term contrapasso to describe the poetic correspondence of the punishment in hell for the earthly sin that damned the sinner. Often it means the suffering you inflicted is inflicted on you, but really Dante's idea is just a more dramatic or dramatized expression of an older Western idea that as animals, not just with logos, but more precisely with souls, we are always already subject to the law of spiritual physics, that the price of sin is an immediate contrapasso in this world. Thus, for example, cruelty to others is cruelty to oneself. And it's not just karma, or what comes around goes around. It's that virtue builds up the soul, but vice destroys it. Listen to what Douglas tells us about Sophia Auld, whose first name, Wisdom, becomes sadly ironic. My mistress, who had kindly commenced to instruct me, had, in compliance with the advice and direction of her husband, not only ceased to instruct, but had set her face against my being instructed by anyone else. It is due, however, to my mistress to say of her that she did not adopt this course of treatment immediately. She at first lacked the depravity indispensable to shutting me up in mental darkness. It was at least necessary for her to have some training in the exercise of irresponsible power to make her equal to the task of treating me as though I were a brute. My mistress was, as I have said, a kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the simplicity of her soul, she commenced, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. In entering upon the duties of a slaveholder, she did not seem to perceive that I sustained to her the relation of a mere chattel, and that for her to treat me as a human being was not only wrong, but dangerously so. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. When I went there, she was a pious, warm, and tender-hearted woman. There was no sorrow or suffering for which she had not a tear. As Douglas describes her, she was at first a walking, talking beatitude. She had bread for the hungry, he writes, clothes for the naked, and comfort for every morning that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these heavenly qualities. Under its influence, the tender heart became stone, and the lamb-like disposition gave way to one of tiger-like fierceness. The first step in her downward course was in her ceasing to instruct me. She now commenced to practice her husband's precepts. She finally became even more violent in her opposition than her husband himself. Nothing seemed to make her more angry than to see me with a newspaper. This sad passage reminds of many things in the Western tradition. For one, of the moment in the Apology in which Socrates turns the tables on the jury. I'm not on trial here, he says. You're on trial. You might kill my body, but in doing so, you might kill your own souls. An injury to her soul is the this-worldly contrapasso Sophia Old suffers. Douglas seems to conceive of her transformation as a descent down the great chain of being, another useful Western conceit. Maybe I'll talk about it with some Shakespeare later. A descent of her whole person from lamb, like Christ, or the Logos, to tiger, an animal without the Logos, and of her heart from angel to stone. By dehumanizing Douglas, she dehumanized herself. She suffers what Douglas calls the brutalizing effects of slavery upon both slave and slaveholder. So, if we want a definition of N-word, it is certainly not man, nor simply brute, but rather a man who is treated as a brute, that is, a rational animal who is treated as an animal, by men who know he's a man, but who keep that secret for their own interests. When Aristotle defines man as a rational animal in the Politics, he says, a human being is the only animal with rational discourse. A more direct rendering is that man is an animal that has logos, a word that can mean reason or language. It's the Greek term translated as word, capital W, in the first line of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And, oh yeah, also, and this is weird, the Word was God. Another podcast. I'm sure Mr. Old didn't read Aristotle, but he seems to have intuited this concept. Take the language away from the rational animal, and he's just an animal. This is not so much the abuse of a human as his negation. And this is what young Douglas learned he must avoid that day when his master forbade his mistress to teach the slave boy to read. Master Old, standing athwart the school doorway as Douglas tried to enter, was a temporary tragedy. But as in a divine tragedy, the fall in fortune is accompanied by enlightenment. As he considers Old's prophecy about what literacy would do to him, the young Douglas has another very Western experience, an epiphany. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. Here we might bifurcate Douglas's graph to show that even if his body is sent back to the stable, his mind and spirit have begun to ascend with new understanding, resolution, and what we might call hunger. Which leads us to another attribute that great authors of Western literature like Augustine, Swift, Goethe, and Frederick Douglass have seen as essential to man. So let's update our definition. Man is not just a rational animal or a rational linguistic animal. He is a rational linguistic restless animal, or as Old predicted, a discontented animal. We'll see how St. Augustine and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, two very different thinkers, treat the theme when we begin part 2.